Well, welcome everyone. My name is Anna Grzmabusa. I'm the director of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, and we are absolutely delighted today to bring to you Catherine Stoner, who is a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, the deputy director at the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law, and the faculty director of the Ford Dorsey Program on International Policy Studies at Stanford University. Catherine received her PhD from Harvard, and prior to coming to Stanford in 2004, she was on the faculty at Princeton University, where she received the Ralph O. Glendinning Preceptorship awarded to outstanding junior faculty. She has also served as a visiting associate professor at Columbia University and at McGill University. She's held numerous fellowships, including those at Harvard University and the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. And in addition to her many articles and book chapters on contemporary Russia, she's the author of two fantastic books, Resisting the State, Reform and Retrenchment in Post-Soviet Russia, and Local Heroes, The Political Economy of Russian Regional Governance. And she is also co-editor, along with Ambassador Michael McFaul, of After the Collapse of Communism, Comparative Lessons of Transitions. So please join me in welcoming Catherine, as today she'll give her talk entitled How to Undermine Democracy and Development, Lessons from Putin's Russia.
Thank you very much. It's fun to be here. I've actually never been to University of Michigan before all this time. But thank you, Anna, and thanks all of you for coming this afternoon. So this is just a collection of thoughts about where Russia is going and why it's going there. And unfortunately, I realized as I was looking over my slides, it's kind of pessimistic. But this won't surprise you if you know Russia at all. I haven't seen very many optimistic talks, right, about Russia, actually ever. I don't think. So I thought, therefore, that I would start with if I can move this forward. Let me see if I can get it to go. There we go. With a kindly picture of everybody's favorite here in the West. That's Mikhail Gorbachev, how he looks today. I don't know how many of us would recognize him on the street, but there he is. You can also see him sometimes at the back of the New Yorker magazine in the Louis Vuitton ads. Have you seen that? Yeah. Anyway, there he is today. And I pulled this quote out from an interview he did with Der Spiegel this summer. He's getting ill. I was actually at the Gorbachev Foundation this summer as well for a while, and he was in the hospital. So, but he is coming out, and I think as he comes to what's clearly the end of his life, being very critical of what's going on in Russia 25 years or more after he began perestroika. And so here's what he said as recently as August of this year. There are no steps forward. On the contrary, they are pulling us back into the past while the country is urgently in need of modernization, whatever that is. Putin wants to stay in power, but not so that he can finally solve our most pressing problems, education, healthcare, poverty. The people are not being asked, and the parties are puppets of the regime. So one of the few people who can say this and not end up in a Siberian work camp, at least not yet. And he's obviously tremendously unpopular still in Russia, but I do think people read what he has to say with interest, at least. So this word modernization comes up in the quote, and I'm not exactly sure what he means by it, but you might remember that Medvedev, some people forget about him, but he's still around, kicking around as prime minister still. I haven't checked the news today, but as far as I know, he's still there. I think his situation's precarious, which is why I mentioned checking the news from moment to moment. But he, of course, introduced this idea of modernization into Russia in the last 3 or 4 years. And so I want to talk about undermining modernization and democracy and development. But I want to talk about modernization in two senses. So the sense of Seymour Martin Lipset, a sociologist who was at Stanford, who came up with this idea in the late 50s, early 60s on modernization and wrote a seminal article on it, and the role of economic development in democratization, and then talk a little bit about what Medvedev might have meant by modernization, and discuss whether or not we see a demodernization and undermining of development in particular. I think there's not a big puzzle about the undermining of democracy, but I'll go over that just so we're all on the same page. So the modernization theory of Lipset is probably familiar to most political scientists, and it's a pretty simple idea, but he was the first to really put it out there in a systematic way, which is essentially that economic growth in a country leads to social change. And what you get is the emergence of a propertied middle class, urbanization, education levels rise, all these good things happen. This middle class demands representation and accountable government. If it's going to be taxed, it wants to be able to say where that money's going to go, what's going to happen to it. And we get this mobilization, either out on the streets or at least articulated demands through political parties and movements that rise up. And this leads to political liberalization and eventually the construction of representative institutions and accountable government, democracy, in other words. Okay, so that's the modernization story. It's a story of really change coming from below, and it's kind of a natural process of accumulation from economic growth and development. So that leads to this political change because it leads to all these social changes and value changes in particular and demands for accountability. So, a question that comes up, I'm teaching with, as I'm heavily influenced by my colleagues at Stanford, so I happen to be teaching a class, and I have for the last 4 or so years, with Larry Diamond, who we call the Dean of Democracy, the Lord of Liberty at Stanford. And our own freedom fighter, because he writes all about democracy. And the course is called Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. So he's a student of Seymour Martin Lipset's, and so a big believer in modernization theory. So one of the discussions we had recently in our class was whether or not Russia is defying Seymour Martin Lipset. Whether it is simply, it should be modernizing in the way that Lipset describes, and I just explained to you, and yet it doesn't seem to be. We don't seem to see this theory bearing out. We can talk about whether or not we see other exceptions. We can certainly see them, I think, in the Middle East to modernization theory. But Russia, you would think is on the road, on Lipset's path at least. So is Putin's Russia defying modernization theory is a topic that we wrestle with some days in our class at Stanford. And, just to point out, the Russian economy is doing exactly what Lipset says it should in order to produce this social change and thus create a demand, at least, for the institutions of representative and accountable government, right? So between 2000 and 2008, sometimes you see it as 7%, sometimes you see it at 8%, so I equivocated and said between 7 and 8%. The Russian economy has grown year on year from 2000 to 2008. We see the emergence of an urban middle class. If you look back through journals, you'll see that there are various articles on Russia's emerging middle class. And actually, if you ask if you have any friends in Russia which class they think they're in, they'll say sredny class, middle class. Everybody thinks they're middle class. Turns out they can't be, but they think that. Increased urbanization, right? People are leaving the countryside, going into cities. Check. That's just what Lipset says should happen. Yet, we see from 2000 onward, and you might even want to take the clock a little bit farther backwards to 1997, 1998, that the content, if not just the formal institutions of democracy, has steadily eroded. And so I don't think there are many people who would actually call Russia a democracy straight up anymore. Anyone in the room want to go for it? Pauline in the back? No, okay. A sovereign democracy. So we can explore what that means. An original democracy, a democracy on its own kind of democracy. Okay. Yes?
2 years ago, Freedom House dropped Russia from Department of Freedom.
It was actually in 2004, so 8 years ago. Yeah, and that's one of the points I was about to make. We did not discuss this beforehand, it's spontaneous. You're right, exactly right. Thank you. Right, so a lot of people agree, and including Freedom House, that Russia doesn't meet that freedom standard. In fact, they've put it in the same category as the Central Asian states in the former communist states. So the content of democracy, even if there still are things called elections happening on a regular basis, has steadily eroded. Those elections are really not determining who's in power. I read an article recently that said the only thing that's uncertain are the rules, not the outcome of Russian elections. And I think we can see the erosion of democracy accelerating further under Putin 2.0. Maybe it's a sovereign democracy in that sense. Every democracy is sovereign. It's its own thing. But we actually have, categories where we classify democracy and generally don't need to hyphenate it. So what are the implications of this for Russia's long-term political and economic development? And by long-term, the farthest I could really go in my head was 6 years. And there's some analysts in Russia who are waiting on the edges of their seats for Putin to be toppled any minute now, and others who think he'll make it the full 6 years of this new mandate and perhaps 12 years. Some think he'll make it 6 years, but not the full 12. So let's go with 6. Well, what is Putinism, first of all, this term, and was there a model of development? He has essentially stated that there was and that there is. But it's one that even his surrogates would say is not a democratic one in the way that we would understand democracy, not just in the West, but I think in most other places. There is weak accountability. As I said, elections don't really decide who's in power or so much what policy is. They don't bring accountability, therefore. They don't necessarily encourage participation from the Russian electorate. This is a bit of a harder point to make because even in consolidated democracies like ours in the US or in West European democracies, where there isn't a law that requires turnout, often turnout's low. We don't know exactly what turnout is in Russia. We suspect some of it is fudged. Dead people seem to be voting a lot there. And it also doesn't seem to bring legitimacy, right, the elections to the regime. In fact, it may even undermine legitimacy, as we've seen in 2011, 2012. I'll get to that in a moment. Another aspect of Putinism is a personalization of power and an emphasis on informal rules over formal institutions. Control of the media, that was one of the first things he did in 2000 by using the central government's ability to control licensing of media outlets, and weak and selective rule of law, right? To my friends, everything; to my enemies, the law has been the which law has been used in Russia. All opposition is viewed as subversive rather than loyal or constructive, and so it makes opposition to the central government a zero-sum game, very risky for the opposition, and a fight to the death for those in government. Generally, in terms of state-society relations, the state works against society in favor of private interests over the public good. As a result, corruption flourishes, and the perspective on the state is really that the state is a vehicle by which to personally enrich oneself. And, of course, security services discourage participation in public policy and politics. Not that you would necessarily instantly be arrested, of course, but life is made difficult for you should you, and increasingly difficult with new laws that have been passed for even taking part in demonstrations. Okay, so those are the ways in which I think we're undermining democracy, or the formal institutions of democracy, with this Putinism model. In terms of undermining development, well, I think the two are related. I'm not sure exactly yet which way, what's causing what. If Russia didn't have oil today and selling it at very high world oil prices, I'm not sure that we would have a consolidated democracy. So I don't think oil is very helpful in terms of encouraging accountable government in Russia. But I don't think the patterns of Russian politics today are as simple as a resource curse theory, a resource curse state would tell us. So it's not just oil alone. But nonetheless, there is this excessive dependence on natural resource export revenue, particularly oil, even post 2008. So the global economic crisis, of course, hit Russia in the fall of 2008. It woke some Russian policymakers up to the fact that we can't really go on this way because, unlike the crisis in 1998, the economic crisis, the 2008 crisis, because it was global, affected everybody, including the people or countries to whom Russia was selling oil and gas. So when the price of oil drops, Russia's economy was suffering disproportionately, and recovery was perhaps a little slower as a result. So there was talk at that point, 2008, 2009, and into 2010, about diversifying the Russian economy, And so we see Skolkova come up. Medvedev's idea of modernization bubbles to the top, and we'll talk about what's happened to that in 2012. We also, though, have had crony capitalism, where, again, personal ties make more difference than necessarily decisions about economic rationality, and property rights extremely uncertain. This is a problem that was, of course, endemic in the 1990s. It's a problem that has not been fixed even in 2012. Extreme inequality has also helped to undermine Russia's development. Inequality began growing in the 1990s and by the late 1990s was up around 3 or 3.5 in terms of its Gini coefficient in Russia. Now it's about, I think, 0.46, which is about where we are here in the United States. Anyway, extreme inequality. Very low investment in human capital, in education, in healthcare in particular. And so we're all aware that Russian life expectancy for males is about 60, 61 years old. The mortality rate is for Russian adults is that of about Botswana. In Africa, mortality in Botswana is driven by HIV/AIDS. In Russia, there are a bunch of different causes. If you want to know more about that, come to my talk tomorrow at noon. I think it's bad governance. Anyway, so there's low investment in human capital. And again, because there isn't an avenue by which to protest, right? So this is related, again, to a lack of accountable government, low investment in infrastructural capital. We do see some building, of course, in Russia of roads, especially in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but not deep infrastructural investment in things like oil pipelines. So extractive capacity of oil could actually decrease relatively soon if there isn't investment in pipelines, for example. And as I mentioned, weak rule of law and uncertain property rights, and this can discourage and has discouraged foreign investment. If you have a choice where you're going to go and have your computer chips built or your widgets built, you can go to India or you can go to Russia. Not that India's got a terrific rule of law system, but property rights are a little more certain, and you might leave with a higher return on your investment. Companies go where oil is, of course, so Russia still has foreign investment, but relative to the potential, especially the educational level of the Russian populace, foreign investment could be much higher. Okay. So these are some of my favorite pictures of the two together because they were happy then. And it's when Medvedev still smiled. So this is back in 2008 as they're getting ready for the election of Medvedev. So initially we have a leadership transition without much of a change, right? And this is, I think, exemplified in Medvedev's plan as he reveals it just before he's elected president in 2008. Emphasis on stability and continuation of the course. I love the passive voice here. That has been chosen. Chosen by whom? We do not want disturbances of any kind. So that doesn't sound like a big growth plan necessarily, but just stability and continuation. But they end up pursuing different paths and are going nowhere fast. So this is, I guess if you wanted to get this legally, you would get it from cartoonstock.com. I just pulled it off the internet, and the beauty of the Mac is just pasting it right in there. So anyway, it's a bicycle going nowhere, Medvedev working hard, and Putin just sitting back, almost going over the precipice. That's how I interpret that anyway. So Medvedev does try. I think it's fair to say from those who've observed him pretty closely. He came to Stanford. Did he come here? Can I pause for a moment and tell you about his Stanford visit then? Okay, so he came to Stanford 2 years ago with an entourage from Russia, and there are a couple of remarkable things about it. First, this was just before Steve Jobs died, so he came from Apple directly to our campus and spoke to about 100 people. So he read from his iPad. So he, is very purposefully puts his iPad down on the lectern. That's all he has. But the Russian delegation is dressed identically, except for their ambassador, who is the Soviet-era ambassador, sitting next to Secretary Rice. They were wearing the sort of Silicon Valley uniform, which is blue blazer, jeans, and cowboy boots, the men and the women. So it was interesting because we, Silicon Valleyites, were all shocked by this, thinking we were all dressed up, and there they were, blending right in with one another and the surroundings. But anyway, I think this was modern dress. These were modern clothes. They were being much hipper than we were in our own environment. But anyway, I think the signal was supposed to be, this is a youthful leader who knows what's what and who's who, and everyone dresses like him. So he came and spoke to us about modernization and about some of the plans to sort of change the Russian economy and get it off this oil dependence. The 2008 crisis, he tells us, is an opportunity. And I think he'd probably been talking to Rahm Emanuel, who at the time said, let no crisis pass without opportunity, being considered an opportunity. So there's some social upheaval, right? Some people are out protesting the drop in their incomes. We see some elite infighting over policy response, and this is actually a good sign in that it produces a pretty good policy response from the Russian government in terms of trying to get out of the economic crisis. They cut some spending, and the economy begins to grow again. Sure, not at a 7 or 8% level as it had before, but 3 to 3.5%, which is quite respectable. Medvedev also comes out with these national projects in transportation infrastructure, communications, health, and education. And we see him liberalizing the political space to some degree as well. He creates these Transparency and Corruption Commission. Actually, a friend of mine was invited on, is a Russian, was invited on to it. And the way that she found out she was on it was she got a call at 8 o'clock in the morning, and it was a Russian friend of hers in Moscow saying, turn on the television, apparently you've been appointed to the Transparency Commission by President Medvedev, and she had been. So she's since quit. But she was I think, impressed initially because he allowed her to speak. This is the head of Transparency International in Moscow. And nothing really happened in the end. And the mix on the commission was sort of aggressive reformers from the outside, and then people who are much more closely aligned with the regime on the inside, and so the committee kind of came to nothing. But remember that he did force through this reporting of income for state officials. The problem was it was reported what income was from all sources, looked to be disproportionately high relative to salaries for many public officials who did this, but there wasn't really any follow-up. Why is your income that high when it really should only be, $30,000, it's $100,000. Nonetheless, that was a gutsy step. And he spoke often of legal nihilism and ending it, right? So the rhetoric was progressive, more progressive, a little bit of liberalization. I don't want to go overboard with how much modernization he did. Exactly in practice, he changed the time zones, remember that? And he eradicated daylight savings time. But that's now apparently going to come back. It wasn't so popular. So these things are slowly being undone, many of them. But Putin in the fall of 2012 now, basically, and actually as early as the spring when he was facing protests in May against his inauguration as president for a third time, he faced a choice to continue this liberalization path and listen to the people who'd come out on the streets earlier in 2012 and late 2011, or to tighten things up and follow his autocratic impulses. And I think it's safe to say he's chosen this resurgence of autocracy and further undermining of democracy. So here they are waving together one of the last times on stage in fall of 2011, and I was looking desperately for it because there's a terrific cartoon by a Russian cartoonist, and I guess they're enforcing copyright. I couldn't find it this morning when I realized I didn't have it. Just before this moment when they come out onto the stage. This is at the United Russia conference almost exactly a year ago. The cartoon has them standing behind a curtain and Medvedev saying to Putin, when are we going to tell them who's going to be president? because evidently he doesn't know himself. I think, the cartoon reflects reality. Those people who seem to know the relationship between the two of them well indicate that I think the announcement was on a Saturday. On the Thursday night before, this is when Putin told Medvedev that he was coming back for certain. Medvedev, I think, really wanted to be president still. And he was, when we saw him at Stanford, and people who've seen him and know him well in the U.S. government have, indicated that this was what he wanted, and he hoped to stay in office. In the end, of course, his loyalty to his mentor has never worked for anyone else in his life. His loyalty to his mentor trumped any personal political ambitions he may have had. So partially in reaction to this castling, and in reaction to, of course, the parliamentary elections in December 2011, we start to see people hit the streets. So maybe we're seeing Lipset. Some commentators think maybe we're seeing him vindicated. This is one of my favorite pictures of Putin that the protesters produced. I think he looks like Dobby from Harry Potter here. Maybe I should have asked you first, but I think that's what they've done, is transposed Dobby's face onto Putin's. Not very flattering. Then in the spring, this is protesting against his election and then inauguration. Putin leave. This is pretty remarkable stuff. We wouldn't have seen this a few years ago. Then again, big demonstration in Moscow in May for fair, pardon me, this must be in March, for fair or honest elections, is what the sign says. And again, huge crowds. We haven't seen huge crowds like this in Russia since the early 1990s, just before the end of the Soviet Union. Of course, protesters being dragged off at times. Then this is not far from the U.S. Embassy in the spring of 2012, a quieter protest as the regime began to crack down a little further just after the inauguration. So, at the time, many people were muttering Arab Spring, Russian Winter, Slavic Spring, and I think there are pretty good reasons why these protests didn't turn into a kind of modernization theory story or Arab Spring. There's some pretty big differences between Russia and what happened in the Middle East in 2010, 2011. First, Putin is still a popular incumbent, even though he won the presidential election with officially just, I think, over 60% of the vote. Even if you grant that there was some fraud, and some people think that the fraud was, as much as an inflation of 20% of the vote, some think it was even higher, it's still the highest percentage of the vote that any of the candidates got. So he was elected, even if there were lies about by how much. He has, a relatively high degree of popular support. Mubarak did not. There's no real prospect of overthrow until there is a realistic alternative candidate to lead Russia. There aren't good alternative candidates to Putin other than Medvedev. And I think Medvedev has been pretty discredited in front of Russians. He had his moment. And he could actually, if you think about it, in the Russian constitution, he actually could have fired Putin as prime minister when, in advance of the United Russia conference. But he didn't. He didn't use the constitutional authority he had. He proved himself to be, weak and really Putin's man, as we suspected all along in the end. And if not Medvedev, it's not clear exactly. It's hard to see people following Alexei Kudrin, the former finance minister. The opposition itself is, partly by design and the actions of the regime in disarray, but partly, the Russian opposition can look at themselves in the mirror as well and share some blame in not being united, not having a platform, not having a single candidate. If we look at the color revolutions in Ukraine and the bulldozer in Georgia and the bulldozer revolution in Serbia, the opposition got together and decided, at least for that moment, who would be the presidential candidate. The Russian opposition doesn't appear able to do that, and that's a huge difference. Until they are, there isn't a reasonable alternative. I think also at times watching these huge demonstrations, which were tremendously exciting and different, got a little carried away with how far outside of Moscow these sentiments went of getting rid of Putin, of unhappiness. There's inside the Garden Ring, right, of Moscow, and then there's the rest of Russia. And there is some support. It would seem genuine support in the rest of Russia. Now, that could be because the media is state-controlled, and when you watch Russian television, you see President Putin doing incredible things. He's putting out fires, literally pulling the lever on the Bush plane to put the fires out as prime minister, then getting on the phone with Medvedev and saying, we've put out the fires, and of course discovering amphoras in the Black Sea, leading cranes on migration, amazing things. So this presumably helps propel the high level of support, but there isn't an alternative. So not all protests, though, need to lead to revolution, right? Evolution can still produce some change. And I don't think these protests were all for nothing, despite the fact that he's still, since those have happened, he's cracked down further. I think there's some genuine fear on the part of the regime of the Russian street, whereas there was not really as much before. At least initially, we see that he's forced to campaign a little in the spring of 2012 before he wins the presidency in March. He does make promises of change and reform, in fact, quite costly ones, that will put their budget into deficit spending for the first time in a long time if he comes through on them and oil prices drop below about $125 per barrel. So he's made some big promises with pension reforms, and he's also had to promise basically to cut back on some other things. We'll see how that goes. The change we see now, though, is on the one hand, well, he's paying off parts of the Russian population for support. On the other hand, he's tightening the screws on other parts of the population. So again, finding ways to undermine any kind of democratization or modernization impulse. Now, some people are calling what Putin has been doing a de-Medvedevization. Try and say that 3 times fast. It's hard. So I broke it up because I couldn't make sure I spelled it properly. But then it's not a real word, so you're not really spelling it badly at all. So some of Medvedev's modest reforms are still in place. And I know a delegation from Stanford Business School recently went to Russia and were led around by the Russian government and went to Skolkovo, Medvedev's special Silicon Valley outside of Moscow. And actually, when he was at Stanford, he was describing his plans for Skolkovo to the audience and comparing it to Silicon Valley. And then he paused and said, I realized that Silicon Valley wasn't built by the American government from the top down. And then he looked down at his iPad and said, but that's the way we do things in Russia. There isn't enough investment, frankly, in Russia, domestic or international, to create something like a Silicon Valley, or to give rise to something like a Silicon Valley, and so they're attempting to design it instead. Others of his, well, one more thing on Skolkovo. It seems to me, at least, that Putin is not at all invested in this and the success of Skolkovo. So if it goes down, it's Medvedev's shame and his failure, not Putin's. If it works, then everybody's a winner. But I'm skeptical that it will, and others seem to be too. Some of his other attempts at modernizing the Russian economy, I think, are in big trouble. We see the return of people like Igor Sechin into this sort of more inner circle, as though he ever really left, into key positions. Again, we see the Siloviki into even more key positions. We see ends of attempts to define conflict of interest legally, and the end of attempts that increase transparency within government. We're still seeing the size of the state grow. So I think there's there's a real question as to whether or not Medvedev will last as prime minister, or whether, the attempts that he's made and the ways in which they're being turned back will mean that he's a very short-term prime minister, and that this deal is just going to be upheld long enough to make it look like it had always been the plan, as Putin said a year ago. I don't think it had always been the plan, by the way. So autocracy is here for now in Russia, but is it here forever? It seems that there are a couple of points of vulnerability of the current regime. So even if we're not following the modernization story exactly, although we did have some people come out on the street, and civil society seemed to wake up, the civil society is not very well institutionalized, and as most of you likely know, Putin has done a lot in the last 6 months in particular to ensure that civil society doesn't institutionalize further, not the least of which is forcing organizations that take money from outside of Russia to be identified as foreign agents, and then the summary closing of USAID, which came in a way as a closing wasn't a complete surprise, I think, to the U.S. government. The speed with which it was being requested was a surprise to the U.S. government. So essentially what happened was a Russian foreign minister sidled up alongside Hillary Clinton at the APEC summit and said, we're going to have USAID out of Russia by October 1st. We just decided last night. And I think it was about September 7th. And so USAID had to scramble around and close down all of its projects, although money it had already granted is still in civil society organizations, so that those will wind down. So what are the points of vulnerability? Well, if we're not following this modernization story, then we probably shouldn't be looking for an immediate or overthrow of the government through social mobilization. So I don't think we're looking for any kind of Russian winter or Slavic spring anytime soon. I think the best we'll get is the elite infighting in response to some exogenous shock, either lower than expected economic performance or the death of Mr. Putin, which seems very unlikely. He seems healthy, but who knows? Or some kind of foreign policy crisis, although a war in Georgia seems to be welcome for most of the Russian public. So, we could get a manufactured enemy to stay in power as well. When I made this point, the possibility of the economic bargain being broken, what I really mean is the bargain between the regime and society. There's a lot of pressure to maintain growth and to have incomes go up constantly. And if that isn't maintained, then, we did see people come out on the street. So it's not impossible, but I think unlikely. In the end, though, is Lipset always right? What time is it in Russia? I always find myself asking. If we wait long enough, maybe Lipset will be right. Maybe modernization is gradually, incrementally bringing this series of value changes and behavioral changes to society, and they won't take it anymore, and will throw Mr. Putin out if he tries to steal another election. The problem is we're not looking for another presidential election for another 6 or so years, so he seems safe for a while. And then since we're in an election year, I thought we could have a discussion about whether or not we think the United States has any leverage over Russia, and whether Mitt Romney really thinks Russia is our biggest geostrategic foe. And he was very careful to point out he meant geostrategic as opposed to just a regular foe. I'm not sure what that meant. So do we have any leverage? Can we stop Russia from being a spoiler in places like Syria, or should we be dealing with Russia in a positive way on things like Syria and at the same time encouraging them to liberalize? I would say that we don't really have very much leverage over Russia. We've cooperated with them and gotten good outcomes on a few key things for us, one of which was supply routes into Afghanistan. We won't need those after 2014 if all goes according to plan. We need some cooperation on Iran, and it would be nice to have cooperation on Syria. So far they've been playing a weak hand relatively strongly. So I'll end with that and see what the reactions and thoughts are. Okay.